Welcome, everyone. My name's Philip Davidson. I'm with BCPS Employees for Free, and we have a special conversation today. We're joined by our friends, the United Healthcare Workers of BC, and we're also joined by United Healthcare Workers of Ontario. And we have two very special guests, Dr. Claudia Chaufan and Dr. Charles Hoffe, who we're going to be speaking to today. But we just wanted to take a moment to let people know a little bit about ourselves as not-for-profit societies and what we're doing here in British Columbia. BCPS Employees for Freedom is a not-for-profit society of BC public servants, current and former BC public servants who stand for medical privacy and bodily autonomy. And we are working together closely with our partners, the United Healthcare Workers BC, in supporting some class action litigation for affected public servants and healthcare workers who were harmed by the COVID-19 vaccine mandates of the provincial government. And we did just recently have a hearing in BC Supreme Court at the end of April and beginning of May, a 5-day hearing on certification of that class action. And it's been extended now, so we're expecting more dates towards the end of this year and a further 10 days to hear that certification application. And we've put out a lot of updates and information about that, so you can check our website and also the United Healthcare Workers of BC website. I wanted to ask one of the representative plaintiffs, who also happens to be the president of the United Healthcare Workers of BC, Terry Perapolkin, who's here with us and who's been actually instrumental in putting together today's session with our special guests. So Terry, come on in and tell us how you're doing.
Hey Phil, I'm just super excited I live actually fairly near Dr. Charles Hoffe, and I've never been able to meet him, where he's been doing his amazing thing and we have been busy doing our thing, and I've never actually got to meet him in person. So this is kind of as close as we're getting, Dr. Hoffe, and I definitely do need to meet you in person. This is just really exciting to have two great speakers today, and I know that our members are really excited for it. And I hope that we have a lot of the members from United Healthcare Workers of Ontario as well, because we haven't gotten to meet up with those people yet. Oh, I see Scarlett there. Hi, Scarlett. Scarlett's working.
How are you?
Anyways,
How
I'm
are you?
so good, Scarlett. It's so nice to
Good.
see you. This is amazing.
Yes.
You guys, we're just kind of, this is going to be chill. We want to hear from our two amazing speakers that we have today, and we want to hear all of your questions for them. These are some amazing people that are, fighting on behalf of us as well, right? It's not all about our class action lawsuits. We're, a big team here. We just want to meet up with all the people who are also on the same side as us. So I'm happy that everybody's able to join us here. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, no, this has been great. And thank you, Terry, for
Thank
putting this
We appreciate
together.
you guys.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Terry. And so what we decided we were going to do is just take turns talking with our guests. So I'm going to start it off with Dr. Hoff here, and then Terry's going to interview Dr. Chauhan and get into her work, which was about the effects of the mandates on healthcare workers in BC. So without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Charles Hoffe. He is a South African trained general practitioner working in rural British Columbia. He was an early whistleblower in the COVID-19 vaccine rollout who attempted to alert the authorities and the public of the serious side effects which he saw in his own patients. Dr. Hoffe was given a gag order by the health authorities and suspended as an emergency room physician for saying that a person with natural immunity to COVID did not need a vaccination. understand the vaccine injuries that he was seeing in his practice, Dr. Hoffe performed D-dimer tests before and after his patients were vaccinated to assess the rate of microclotting. This revealed that more than half of patients sustained intravascular clotting. This information publicly, his town of Lytton, BC, and medical practice were destroyed by fire. He was evacuated and his patients scattered. The BC College of Physicians and Surgeons later charged Dr. Hoffe with professional misconduct for spreading misinformation and appointed a disciplinary committee to try him. They employed many means to try to discredit Dr. Hoffe, and over a 4-year period, but just recently, we have learned that all charges have been dropped against him. So I wanted to get more into this, but I really want to hear it from you in your own words, Dr. Hoffe. So first of all, thank you for joining us today. And I'll have to say, like, you first came to my attention when you published an open letter to Dr. Bonnie Henry, I believe it was in April of 2021, detailing some of the very harmful effects that you were seeing from patients in your practice who had received the COVID-19 vaccination, the mRNA vaccination. And that was quite a letter. And for some context, of course, that was before any mandates were imposed on healthcare workers in this province and public servants. But you were bringing this awareness to light to the public, but also importantly to the provincial health officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry. So when you wrote that letter, did you have any inkling or idea of what would ensue and what has now happened over the last 4 years?
No, Philip, I had no idea. I mean, I'd been given a gag order for communicating with the other healthcare workers in my community of Lytton and the adjacent community of Lillooet, who were actually giving these shots. I had made it very clear to them that I had absolutely no confidence in the safety data because there wasn't any safety data. And so I said I would be an observer, but I would not participate because I believe we need to be evidence-based. And so it all started when 12 countries in Europe had shut down the AstraZeneca shot, and they were still giving it in Canada, and Trudeau had ordered 60 million doses for Canadians. And I sent a warning to my colleagues saying that there is a personal liability issue. If you are giving these shots to people without informing them of the known risks, you are personally liable. And this is called informed consent. It's a foundational principle of medical ethics. So I was told by the health authorities, somebody in that group of 18 people, this wasn't on social media, this was a private email to 18 colleagues. Somebody sent that to our regional health authority, who sent it to the college as a complaint. And I was effectively just warning people about a safety signal and about the principle of informed consent. That's all I was doing. And I was told that I was putting people at risk by creating vaccine hesitancy for drawing attention to a safety signal. And then after that, I saw what it was doing to my own patients. Before that, I'd actually been away for 6 weeks, so I hadn't even been there in the practice. And there was the first thing I did on the first day I got back was to send this email to my colleagues. And then I started actually seeing what it was doing to my patients. And then I sent a letter to Dr. Bonnie Henry, who was the BC, still is the BC provincial health officer. And I was in a very fortunate situation that I knew how many people had been vaccinated, and I knew how many vaccine injuries I had discovered so far. So I could literally give statistics. I could literally say the rate of serious vaccine injury in our population is, I don't know, it was 1 in 200 or something like that. And the overall rate was 125 of all vaccine injuries. And we had not had a single COVID casualty in our community. We hadn't had a single person that needed any care for COVID up until that point. So I pointed out to her that, the evidence that I had from my medical practice was that these shots were more dangerous than COVID. And So I pointed out the ethical violations of continuing to give an experimental treatment when you know it's causing harm, and that this is unethical. And so the college considered all of this to be misinformation. You literally weren't allowed to mention any talk of vaccine injuries was conceived to be putting people at risk, because you were creating vaccine hesitancy by drawing attention to a safety signal, which I saw in my own patients. And so that's really where it started. And I mean, I had no idea where this was going to go. But I think with the wisdom of hindsight, I wouldn't have changed anything. I did my duty. I mean, I literally did my duty. You know, we as healthcare professionals, we go into this because we want to serve people with a heart of compassion. We go into this not to serve ourselves, but to serve others. And that's what I love about healthcare, is that element of love and compassion that motivates us. I mean, it's a beautiful ethic, the fact that you go there to serve. And so, you know, I'm a Christian, so I also have the Christian ethic of considering others more important than yourself. So that when you are threatened, my motive was, well, am I considering, if I keep silent, am I considering others more important than myself? And so I couldn't keep silent because people were being harmed and it was my duty to warn them. And so I guess that's, in a nutshell, yeah, how it started and how I got into so much trouble.
Yeah, well, and you touched on some things I wanted to ask you about, about why, you went into medical practice, and you mentioned generally what draws people to that. So I want to ask you about that, but I also want to ask you if you'd ever encountered such a stark ethical issue or quandary before in you've practiced for many years up to that point. But first, what drew you into practicing medicine, and then, what was this like going through that stark issue?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I had originally wanted to be a vet because I love animals and I wanted to care for animals, but I didn't have high enough grades to get into veterinary school, but I had high enough grades to get into medical school. So I became a doctor instead. But it was the same ethic of compassion, of just caring for those that need care. And I think it's such an honorable, healthcare is such an honorable profession because it serves others. It's not supposed to be self-serving. It's supposed to be about serving others, which is where we put their interests above our own. I've had patients in the emergency room swing at me and try to knock my lights out, and demented people and psychiatrists. And so there's a certain element of risk, where some people hate you because you're trying to stitch them up, but you do it nevertheless, because you care for them and they're not in their right mind. And so I just think these foundational ethics of love and compassion should be what empowers us and what motivates us as healthcare providers.
And then maybe getting back to the second part of my question there, had you ever encountered any, in all of your interactions with the health authorities or health apparatus that we have here in British Columbia, had you ever encountered any instances where you've felt that people that you report to were behaving unethically or, prior to this moment? Because
No,
you were questioning provincial health officer. So yes.
Yeah. No, it was suddenly weird. It was suddenly when COVID hit, the regulatory bodies utterly changed. The media, I mean, I knew the media hadn't been honest for a long time. And so I actually gave away my television set in 1995 because I didn't want it in my house. And I think that really helped, the fact that I didn't have television, because then I could see the truth. I wasn't, I'd go and visit my mother and I'd watch her television and I'd think, boy, I'm glad I'm not watching this stuff, because I'd be terrified if I was. But I knew that they weren't honest, and that they were it was all full of half truths, and that's what they use to deceive people, is half truths. It's what they don't tell you is the critical part. It's sort of selective reporting in order to lead you to the wrong conclusion. So I had the colleges suddenly became the opposite of what they were supposed to be. They were supposed to ensure the ethical and safe practice of medicine. They were supposed to regulate doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals to make sure that, and the primary ethics were, firstly, that there was nothing unethical. In other words, there had to be informed consent. There should never be a cover-up of evidence of harm. If harm is done, you are obliged to reveal it to the patient. You're not allowed to pretend nothing happened. And patient bodily autonomy was huge. I mean, you never, ever force somebody to have a medical treatment that they do not want, ever. And all of these ethics were completely turned on their head. It was like suddenly they became possessed by this irrational force that made them literally the opposite of what they were supposed to be. And I made 3 speeches outside the BC College on that, and in a medical tyranny process. There were 3 protests, and I was there wagging my finger at the college, and I knew they were watching me out of the windows, calling them to abide by the same code of ethics that they have held me to for the last 33 years. They have held me to the code of ethics of the Canadian Medical Association, and yet they were not abiding by those ethics. So I called them a bunch of hypocrites. That's what they were. They had a double standard that they held other people to, but wouldn't abide by themselves. And so COVID really changed things. Things were turned on their head. And the same with the media, who people had sort of trusted would tell us the truth and expose evil and reveal truth, became the complete opposite. They became the biggest purveyors of misinformation. And of course, anyone that showed their lies was a spreader of misinformation, in their words, And so, and the government, which is supposed to maintain justice and law and order and protect the innocent and punish evildoers, became the complete opposite. They all literally became the opposite of what they were supposed to be. And it was very odd how abruptly this all happened.
And so for diligently and responsibly and professionally reporting instances of harm that you're observing in your practice, the professional regulator in BC, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, turned around and charged you with misconduct for spreading misinformation. And sorry, did we? You might have
Bill, I
lost me.
think we lost you there a little bit. You were talking
Sure.
about we're talking about the College of Physicians and Surgeons there. I think we wanted
Yeah.
a little
So
bit more about what happened there, hey?
yeah, my computer froze midway through the question. I'll repeat it.
Okay,
So for very responsibly and professionally reporting instances of harm that you observed in your practice to the health authorities, the professional regulator, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, turned around and charged you with misconduct for spreading misinformation. Could you tell us about that and how that's all played out now?
Yes, well, after I'd sent that letter to our provincial health officer informing her of what I was seeing in my own patients, the college then sent a letter to every doctor in BC, and apparently all the colleges across Canada echoed the same thing. They sent a warning letter to all doctors warning you that if you were guilty of misinformation around COVID or the COVID vaccines, that you would be investigated and, if necessary, disciplined. So they effectively gave a gag order to every practicing doctor in Canada. And this had the chilling effect of driving most people, the vast majority, into silence, literally just to defend themselves, to basically just nobody wanted to be put under investigation, because you have to realize that you're not being investigated by a neutral body. When they appoint a disciplinary committee, these people all work for the college. This is not an impartial jury. They pick the jury. So this is not about justice, and they almost never lose a case because they have huge financial resources and they've picked the jury. So it's not exactly like you're being tried by an impartial group, but obviously, so they created an illusion of compliance in the entire medical profession by literally threatening people about what they called misinformation. And of course, misinformation was stating anything that they didn't agree with. It's an arbitrary term that was devised by the Soviets. It's a Soviet term to shut down freedom of speech, to accuse somebody of misinformation. And so I, of course, ignored that because I knew I was already under investigation. But what really got me into trouble was that I went on a series of speaking tours when they authorized these shots for children. And I knew that COVID was almost zero risk to healthy children. I mean, literally, there hasn't been a single healthy child or adolescent in Canada that died of COVID at any time in the pandemic, not one. And yet they were forcing them to have these shots to play hockey and to participate in things at school. And they were forcing university students to have it, to continue on with medical training and a variety of other things. And I knew the fertility repercussions of this because of how much was ending up in the ovaries. We knew that from the Pfizer biodistribution study, that the ovaries were in the top 4 organs for where those spike proteins ended up. And so I knew that this was not about keeping people safe. There was no other logical purpose for forcing young people to have this other than to reduce the population, to reduce fertility. And of course, when fertility is reduced in women, it's permanent because you can't make new eggs. Once your eggs are damaged, that's it. You're done for the rest of your life. So I went on a series of speaking tours with another doctor called Stephen Malthouse from Denman Island, and we went through, I don't know, somewhere between 40 and 50 different Canadian cities doing town hall meetings. I mean, but it was during COVID, so often the town halls wouldn't let us use their facilities because we were spreaders of misinformation. And so we often, if it was out in parks, it was in winter, it was freezing cold, but it was to try and warn people of the evidence of harm, and particularly to try and protect the children, to try and warn parents that this COVID is not a risk to your children, but these shots seriously are. We knew at that point that 1 in 30 adolescents was getting myocarditis from this, of which more than 50% were completely asymptomatic. And so these people would have permanent heart damage and have no idea that their heart is damaged and that they will have a reduced life expectancy as a result. So when I went on these speaking tours, that really, really antagonized the college. And then they issued a citation against me. And so they set a trial date. And as I mentioned, this trial is not exactly a just process because they pick the jury. And so the first thing they did was they had an expert witness called Dr. Trevor Cornell, who was Dr. Bonnie Henry's right-hand man through the first 2 years of this pandemic. And he was essentially just a family doctor who had specialized in public health. So he wasn't really an expert in any of the areas of accusation that because they, the areas that they didn't like. They didn't like me talking about microclotting and infertility and myocarditis and neurological injuries, which is what I'd reported to Bonnie Henry, and risk to children and all of these things. They considered all of this misinformation. So the first thing they did was to do what sort of a massive dump of scientific information very shortly before the trial, so that they knew my lawyer wouldn't have time to deal with it. It was like a blitzkrieg kind of tactic where you just overwhelm your opponent by volume and speed, and so. According to the bylaws, I think, of the college, you had to give the evidence that you were going to rely on for your expert testimony 14 days before your hearing. And my lawyer had actually been sick, and so he'd applied for an adjournment. So we never put in anything because we were waiting for this adjournment, which never came. But they gave us their testimony, which was this vast amount of stuff that they knew that he couldn't possibly cope with in that space of time. And so you can't mount an adequate defense because you're just swamped. So this was their first tactic, was to try and just overwhelm my defenses by using this, because they had lots of lawyers. I had one. So after that, I realized I needed a different lawyer because I had a constitutional lawyer. So fortunately, by the grace of God, they did adjourn it because I hadn't submitted any defense. I was literally going to this trial with no defense. And so by the grace of God, they realized this wasn't actually going to be fair. Well, I didn't think it was going to be fair in any case, but anyway, they adjourned it. And then I got a really good lawyer who got 8 expert witnesses, which literally a world expert to deal with every one of the 8 areas of accusation against me. So I had a Dr. James Thorpe from Florida, who's he's a gynecologist. So he was going to talk about the infertility issues. And then I had Dr. Peter McCulloch to talk about the myocarditis. And I had Dr. Pierre Corey, who was going to talk about ivermectin. They didn't like me telling people that they should use ivermectin. So I had literally like the world expert on each thing. And when the college saw this, their response was to apply for judicial notice. And so judicial notice is an important thing for people to know about because it was massively misused during the pandemic. Judicial notice is a legal process where a court declares certain facts to be irrefutable. And it's the purpose of it is supposed to be to simplify the court process. Like, if you say, we will give judicial notice to the fact that the sky is blue, and then you don't have to prove the sky is blue because you just take it as self-evident and irrefutable that everyone knows the sky is blue. But the facts of the college, the first one was that these shots are safe and effective. And that was the first, they had 8 facts, and that was the first one. And so they wanted the college to grant judicial notice. They said the fact that Health Canada approved these shots is the proof that they're safe and effective. Health Canada wouldn't have approved it otherwise. Therefore, it's irrefutable, and we're not even going to debate that. And so fortunately, my lawyer was very wise. The college had 7 lawyers working on my case. They were really determined to make me the poster boy, to strike fear into the heart of every other doctor out there, to intimidate them into silence. I mean, they were doing to me what they had threatened to do to any doctor who didn't agree, basically. And so the college's lawyers didn't want the medical evidence that my expert witnesses had to get to the disciplinary panel. So they applied for judicial notice to just get the panel to just say, nope, this is irrefutable, it's safe and effective. And then essentially I would have had no defense. I wouldn't have been able to talk about the vaccine injuries in my own patients, and none of my expert witnesses would have been able to testify about the evidence of harm, and none of their expert testimonies could be admitted as evidence because it would have been, they would have had judicial notice about that, so you can't submit that evidence. So fortunately, my lawyer, in his response to their application for judicial notice, and their application was literally about 1,000 pages of documents, and they gave him 9 days to respond. So again, it was a swamp tactic. It was a very unjust, unfair tactic, knowing that I had one lawyer. And giving him all, anyway, he did a brilliant job. He had to pull in other people to help him because he had a huge time crunch, but he literally used that in his response. He took bits and pieces from these expert testimonies to show the panel that there was huge evidence that put the safety of these shots in question. And by doing this, literally set a precedent where I think it was about the first time in Canada in this whole pandemic that this judicial notice thing didn't work, because fortunately he was able to get enough pertinent evidence before the panel that they didn't grant it. So the last thing they did was then, when they couldn't get judicial notice, they then said, well, they now want 8 expert witnesses, because they just had one who was way outranked by what I had. I had the world experts, and this guy wasn't really an expert in anything. But so they then said, well, they want 8 expert witnesses. So, I mean, like the fight is really on now, stacking the odds on both sides. And so when they couldn't find 8 expert witnesses, and they then tried to schedule the trial for a time when they knew my lawyer wasn't available. And when I complained, about that, they told me I need to get another lawyer. If he's not available, you've just got to get another lawyer. And I said, well, this is a highly complex issue. The expert testimonies from my expert witnesses was almost 1,000 pages of top-notch scientific stuff. To get another lawyer to be able to handle this in cross-examinations and all this stuff was craziness. But anyway, so fortunately, by the grace of God, they realized it was only fair that I should be able to have legal representation of my choice. And so when they didn't grant that, when they said, no, this has to be at a time when the lawyers from both sides are available, then the college just dropped everything. I mean, they had tried every corrupt tactic. But I think the take-home message is that you have to have really good legal defense. You need to find somebody who really knows what they're doing. And the fellow that I got, who's Lee Turner, he was a personal injury lawyer for COVID. So he was familiar with medical legal things. Having a constitutional lawyer was worthless, because they just trampled on the Constitution because they said we had an emergency, and so it didn't count. So I think that was the real take-home message, is you've got to be very strategic. I mean, Lee studied the college, and he looked at all of the cases before, and what was working here and what was working there, or what was not working, what was succeeding, what was failing, and what are the key things we really have to focus on. So you need to be tactical and strategic and have the best. And I truly got the best. All of those 8 expert witnesses, all because they'd all heard of me, and they'd heard of this D-dimer tests that I'd been doing, and the proof of the microclotting, and they'd all heard of me. And so they all independently offered to give their testimonies completely free of charge. I mean, none of them charged 1 cent. I mean, and Lee told me that, normally for that kind of quality of scientific evidence, I would have been looking for a bill from the 8 of them somewhere between $200,000 and $400,000 for that caliber of expertise. And they literally all did it free of charge. So this was the grace of God, because there were enough people involved in these things who held to these ethics that we all hold to. I mean, that's why we're here at this thing, is because we want to stand up for what's right. And these people truly did. And so they were willing to come to bat for me, to support me. And we won. It was just it was wonderful.
Well, your story is incredible, Dr. Hoff, and those administrative settings can be just brutal because the odds are stacked against you. And even if you were to go to court after the college process, you would almost have your hands tied as well because of the deference that's given to administrative decision makers in our legal system. So. Um, I think, in addition to having good legal representation that helped you prevail in this situation, you had one other very important thing, which was in very short supply throughout the whole COVID-19 experience. Unfortunately, amongst all of our colleagues, I think, we knew that there was more of us who understood these issues but for one reason or another felt compelled to keep quiet and didn't want to speak out. But you, on the other hand, took a very, very courageous position to go out and to speak on behalf of your patients and to the public about the harms that you're witnessing. And for that, a true inspiration to many, many people in this country and beyond our borders. So I just want to thank you on behalf of everyone here for the very principled stand that you've taken, and we just really appreciate you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I wanted to, and we'll bring Dr. Charles Hoffe back in momentarily, but we do have another guest who has some great things to share with us, and Terry's gonna interview her right now.
Hey, Claudia.
Hey,
So,
Terry.
hey, Bill, I just wanted to let you know that it's actually Claudia Chaufan, not Chauhan. We ended up with an H in there. It's actually an F. It's
Thank
nice
you.
to see you again, Claudia. Don't mind me. I'm wrapped in a blanket because I'm cold in
Oh,
my
that's
air
totally fine. Thank you.
conditioner.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, so how was that getting to listen to Dr. Hoff, right?
Oh, it was very moving because I remember as I said before when we were meeting in preparation, I've used some of the many video clips that Dr. Hoff has, given interviews, etc., throughout with my health policy students, and longer and the shorter, etc. And they invariably cause a major impact. I mean, I teach a variety of policy cases throughout courses, right? But part of this has been, obviously COVID. So, and I give a range of, views, like I will put some of the big talking heads for students to listen to. This is one side, this is the other side. And I have to do barely nothing. Once my students have listened to Dr. Hoff, it makes such a big impression. We can have terrific conversations around the contrasts between perspectives. So
Yeah.
it was a great pleasure and honor, Charles, to be able to be like live. Yes.
That's wonderful. So just to introduce to all of the people who are here on the meeting. So Claudia Chaufan, I have been able to meet her a little bit over Zoom. She's in Ontario. And so she is a professor of health policy and global health at York University in Ontario, with an MD from the University of Buenos Aires and a PhD in sociology and philosophy from the University of California, Santa Cruz. A past US Fulbright scholar, she researches the impacts of COVID-19 vaccine mandates, focusing on termination, coercion, and mental health tolls. So that's very brief, Claudia, as to what you do. We've had the joy of meeting you through the surveys that York University and yourself and your colleagues put out for the healthcare workers in Ontario. You started with the healthcare workers in Ontario, and then you moved to BC, and you even did the surveys for the healthcare workers in Alberta that were based on the COVID mandates. So, I know that you think that we did a great job getting the surveys out, but for us, this was something that we were just really hoping and wishing that someone would do. So this was a very big deal to you know, all of the healthcare workers. And Philip, I'll even say it affects, it's the same with the public servants in all of those provinces. Like, as you know, Claudia, and I've looked at all of the survey results and everything, and it's, you know, it's similar across the whole, you know, the whole country, and it's going to be similar across all of the different sectors, right? The public servants, the healthcare workers, it's similar. So anyways, you guys, so that is who Claudia is. She has done these surveys and she has reported on them. Philip, I think that you shared them with your members as well, and we've shared them across all of our members. But so, Claudia, the first question I just want to ask you is, tell us about your background and what led you to focus on health policy and global health.
Well, you know, I've been thank you for that introduction, Terry, and the questions, and I'm trying to make it brief. But anyway, I started my professional life back in Argentina. So as I, you know, plain through vanilla, a clinician, right? I was a physician, practicing physician for close to a decade. I was quite young at the time. We go to medical school right after high school, so I didn't have much experience in anything else. And that's how I got started in a profession that I, you know, I loved. I really enjoyed doing what I was doing, but, you know, life has its way. So ultimately, I ended up in North America, pursuing a degree in sociology with a notation in philosophy. And of course, you know, giving my longstanding interest in health, focusing on health issues, but becoming a sociologist. So as a sociologist, I'd say you take a view, you know, of the macro, of the big picture of things. So why, you know, societies and large communities work the way they do, uh, you know, the dynamics, the social dynamics. You look at history, how things come to be the way they are, et cetera, et cetera. So I became quite fascinated with that. And, well, again, those things of life, I ended up in Canada. I'm married to a Canadian, a person who grew up in Canada, although he also has been around the world, et cetera, et cetera. But we ended up in Canada. And I was very excited to come to Canada. I came to York University. I was excited about a new job that I had been offered and ended up in my current position. And Canadians are seen throughout the world, and particularly Latin America. We have a long history of victimhood under American imperial pursuits. Canada is not seen as, you know, such a power and, you know, political control, right, over us. I grew up under a military regime, so that also gave me some insight into what we all experienced under COVID, although unbeknownst to me, because I thought that some of the things that we observed only happened under military dictatorship. I was a right-wing military dictatorship, so anybody who had some social sensibility was considered, I don't know, communist, and fodder for. I mean, it was pretty violent. Part of my youth and my high school, etc. It was under a very, very rough period of a military dictatorship back in Argentina. So when COVID came, it took me a while to go back to my medical roots and look into the medical issues, right? I was looking at some of the sociological issues and political issues, but relying, you know, silly me probably, on the word of public health agencies and medical colleges, because as a young physician back in Argentina, we used to look up to them with great admiration because we are backward and they know what they're talking about. As it turns out, it wasn't quite the case. So I quite relied on that. But, you know, those things that happen in life, I started reading some of the medical literature. I was not exposed to anybody who had been injured. And at the time, there were no vaccines. This was late 2020. And we were all sent home from the university. You know, professor, you have to teach from a computer. And I thought they probably knew what they were doing. And but long story short, I began to see and look at the evidence sent to me by kind of a range of people on, well, first off, early treatment, the existence of options to, stay home, be afraid, and cover yourself up, with, 10 masks until we have a vaccine. And I learned that that wasn't the case. And I have to say that in Argentina was one of the leading countries in the world to use ivermectin, because we have a lot of poverty there. And we have a lot of parasites, because, parasites come with poverty, and parasites go along ivermectin and other, drugs, antiparasitic drugs. So there were a bunch of, people there, among the others, Hector Carvalho, who was from my own university, a bit older, and who were using ivermectin quite successfully, and people weren't dropping dead, frankly, right? So anyway, that was the first thing. Early treatment was the first thing that hit my awareness, my medical awareness, in addition to the looking at the sociology, right? And then I bumped into VAERS, the VAERS reporting system, and I started looking at the injuries. So I didn't have, unlike Dr. Hoffe, I didn't have the clinical experience at the time, but I was horrified by what I saw in VAERS, and particularly because, I have been, very reluctant, very, very skeptical, and while aware of the machinations of mainstream media, right? You grow up in a country like Argentina, you never believe the media, right? Everybody knows they lie, and you just, move on with your life and try to, be as well as you can. But you don't believe the government, you don't believe the media. That's the culture that I was brought up in. So it was a culture of trust, like Canadians, I believe, are. So it wasn't that hard for me to understand that, the media was lying, the government was lying, but that the medical authority was lying was a bit of a surprise to me, because that's the one place where I had, still my trust. But then you trust and you verify. So when I started verifying, things didn't look so good. And and things got worse when I was told, professor, you need to take the shot. And I said, but I'm home, right? So I was teaching from home and we had to take the shot. So did my students. Anyway, at that time, I had already joined the Canadian Citizens Care Alliance, at the time, COVID Care Alliance. It was barely an organization. We didn't have a website. We didn't have anything. But I felt very lonely at the time, and I thought I was the only one that was seeing weird things. So that's how it started. That's essentially my history of how COVID policy, not COVID the virus, but COVID policy, the policy response, the public health response became essentially, I don't know why I'm raising my hand, these technical things happen without my intention. So that became a complete obsession. I was like literally blown away. And there was a little bit of, precedent was the talk of misinformation. It was more than the jabs themselves, this talk of misinformation, that I thought, well, this is propaganda. It was, I studied the history of propaganda. It actually goes back, well before the Soviets. It starts in the late 19th century, but, the war industry was one of the drivers of, mass propaganda in the era of mass democracy at the turn of the 20th century, right? So and of course the Soviets participated too, and I don't want to say that they didn't, but it was also the Western world, right, was real masters of propaganda, including, as we don't know, the Nazi propaganda, but also, the North American propaganda, British propaganda. So real ministers of truth, so to speak, in a real Orwellian sense. So those things kind of began to connect. And all of a sudden I was horrified that here I was in Canada with all my life in Canada, after having lived in a few countries, and seeing that they were coming after people for not taking a shot. And and the rest, as we say, is history. And stop there.
Claudia, I really love hearing that, because that's one thing that we've noticed. I don't know if the other groups, but our group for sure, we have a lot of people in our membership who came to Canada from other countries to, live the dream, live the Canadian dream, right? And there's I would say the majority of our members are people who are seeing things that they never expected to see in Canada, right? I will say I'm not one of those members. I haven't witnessed, the type of things that we're seeing in Canada now, but I've learned so much from our members who that's why they're fighting, is because they came here to get away from the government control, all of that kind of stuff, right? So
Yes.
I really appreciate that from you.
Mhm.
That's it's honest and truthful,
Right.
and
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So that's great to hear that this is how you felt, but what was it that actually motivated you to start researching on the effects of the mandates on healthcare workers?
Well, it was also a set of fortunate, kind of serendipitous circumstances. My day job, or my paid job, as a matter of fact, was, I teach and I do research, right? I do social research or policy research, and there's no way I could not do it. I mean, I was doing research on a bunch of things that affect human health, so how could I not research this? Now, the question was, that's kind of obvious, but my situation was, how am I going to do it in an environment that doesn't want you to research this, right? And they're not telling you, it's not direct. There is no, unlike in a military regime, that you don't do this, you don't do that, otherwise your head is chopped off, metaphorically or even literally. But in a system like this, you have other mechanisms of suppressing dissent, like, destruction of your professional reputation. And I mean, I'm the least equipped to talk from personal experience, because I'm sure that all of you, or the audience, including Dr. Hoff, knows, much more about that than me. But I know the literature that has been done around it, defunding if you want to research, et cetera, et cetera. All the politics of the so-called medical industrial complex, that is not a new concept, but it's a concept that goes back to the 80s, and I teach to my students. And in fact, that concept also came out of the concept of a military industrial complex, which is a war machinery that drive, nation states, particularly nation states in the West, just to bring in their populations, to persuade them that there's an enemy, to distract them from looking at the enemy, in your own state, and let's rally you around the flag so that you go, half a world away to bomb other people, right, and you destroy other countries. So I've been on the receiving end of that, but in the center, things looked kind of different. So that sort of, medical industrial complex, it's a legitimate object of research for me. I didn't have to ask permission for that, although then I thought, well, who's going to want to publish or even listen to these other voices that are being silenced in the field, namely in the front lines of healthcare, quite brutally. But what else was I going to do, right? I mean, I couldn't do anything else, and I felt quite choked, frankly, at the beginning. But I decided to get started. And the beginning was researching, the concept of misinformation, the ideological work that was being done using that word against people like Dr. Hoff and other health professionals. So as an academic, you're very free. You can do that systematically. Then the question is, who's going to publish it? Because you have a career in academia, you have to publish in certain circles, right? So I was quite lucky. I became quite, well, first of all, how many people read about these things? Not very many, right? So I thought, okay, let me just try and find places, and I did. And I put together a, small group of students of mine, and everybody wants to gain research experience. So I started looking at, essentially as a sociologist with a medical background, the concept of misinformation in the medical world, specifically in COVID, right? So I worked on that. And then people in the health field, specifically in the healthcare workers of Ontario, reached out to me. It was late 2021 for help with writing some letters for the government, Doug Ford. And I was just desperate to do something, and I couldn't treat people. I couldn't save them from the job. I mean, so I had to do something. So I said, okay, let me just help these folks. And, I agreed to do that. That was part of my work as a volunteer of the CCCA. So that kind of, started the ball rolling. And then I was asked other questions and I didn't know the answer. And I thought, okay, let's get an answer to that. Let's document the experience of the healthcare workers themselves. And it started as an afterthought and it turned into my major project, frankly, of looking at the impact of COVID policies on the healthcare labor force. And it started in Ontario, and the results were so extraordinary. And if I can mention, Scarlett was very instrumental in that, and another person from the same organization. They helped me, like you, Terry, and BC, to get out the voice. I wanted to get vaccinated people too. I wasn't that, and people who support it. But it was very, very hard because people who approached me, probably because I was the only researcher allowing them to speak rather than researching vaccine hesitancy, right? As if they had a mental health problem, right? Which was essentially the assumption throughout the literature, was that anybody who hesitates has to be, a crackpot or at least ignorant. So people started telling me their stories. I mean, way beyond my expectations. And that kind of, encouraged me. I said, okay, let's go to BC. And that was BC, and then came Alberta. So it started a bit of an afterthought, and now it became a real, the things that I'm doing that, and I'm sort of in parallel, I continue looking into the, misinformation business, and it's extremely productive. My hope is that people like you can use it when you go to class action suits, and, in the same way that you show, that the opposition shows, the sort of pro official policy propaganda, you can use, some of the publications and show that these things are real and they have been recognized in the academic literature.
Amazing, Claudia. I have so many questions, so I'm not even going to go to the questions that I have here because they're silly compared to what I want to ask you. So how have you not been shut down? So you see, we had Dr. Hoffe here who was trying to talk about it, and he just got shut down. His college is like, you can't talk about it anymore. How are you able to continue talking about it?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I've asked myself that. I have a few tentative answers. Well, first of all, had I been working as a physician, I would not have survived. I would have run the same fate as Dr. Hoffe and so many others, because it would not have been possible for me to do what they asked me to do. So I would have just suffered the consequences of that, as Dr. Hoffe did. As an academic, things are slightly different. First of all, who reads these things, right? Academic stuff, you write them. It's, so long as you find a publisher, you get to do it, right? I also was very fortunate that in the height of the COVID craze, I had a sabbatical year. So I was able to stay put, concentrate on my research, and not have many conversations, because I was, in fact, shut out and pushed away from a number of groups that I was involved with, of academics involved with. I'm very interested in geopolitics. I teach, global health and global issues and geopolitical issues. And all these people whom I had considered my comrades of decades, a few of them I would say, like, shut me out, like, shut me off. I had become a Trump supporter overnight. And even more so when I joined the, I have to say, one of the things that I recovered, kind of my hope that there was a way out, or light in the end of the tunnel, as they say, was the trucker convoy, right? So perhaps those are my first heroes. I hope nobody takes offense. And then come the healthcare workers. So when I saw that, I thought, oh my God, this is the revolution I was, waiting for, right? Like, I studied revolutions, right? Latin American revolutions, the revolutionary Latin American movement, anti-imperialism, etc. This is what I was waiting for. So I was even more struck to see the response of people who have typically supported revolutions attack these people, right? And I thought, oh my God, this is it. This is, there is, this is a way out, right? So, so as a result of those things, I was thrown out, but thankfully not from official positions. And going back to your question, perhaps, well, number one, I was on sabbatical. Number two, when I came back, things were had mellowed a little bit. And I had an overhaul of my own teaching because my own sort of conception of, world politics kind of changed. I thought, this is weird, right? I mean, if you're with working people, you're not going to support employers against working people who want to force them to take a job, right? That doesn't make any sense in my mind. So I overhauled my teaching. I revised, substantially my courses, and I started teaching about COVID as part of broader issues, right? So, and, but how was I not, attacked? I don't know. Probably because I don't pose too much danger. I'd be very honest, right? I mean, academics are supposed to do what they do. If you publish and you bring reputation to your university, nobody, I don't go into other people's courses to tell them what to teach or how to teach, and they don't do that with me. It would have been very different had I been speaking up, treating patients. Right. As I said, I think that was really, dangerous profession to have, probably the most dangerous profession to have, which is also very scary. So I thought, well, the least I can do, my contribution has to be intellectual. And if people will give me their voices and stories, I'm going to put them out for the world to see.
I love that, Claudia. And I think that Dr. Hoff really probably appreciates what you said is, they only attacked the people who were really gonna, make like, immediate kind of reactions from the public, I think is what they did, is kind of the way that I feel about it. So the doctors that were speaking up about it immediately and going to the media seemed to get hit hard because they didn't want the people of the public to hear about it, right? Whereas what you did, it was amazing, but it wasn't this immediate threat to what was going on.
No, it wasn't. And you know what, if I may say something, you make me think about something right now, is that doctors have had such a high, not just reputation, but the establishment counts on doctors to reproduce and to disseminate establishment views.
Right.
So you lose doctors and they become your enemy. And when the establishment, you become the enemy of the establishment, that's it, right? And I know that because I grew up under such a system. So interestingly, I observed that there is not much difference, although there may be, the difference is not irrelevant, but in a way, deep inside, the so-called, capitalist democracies or democracy, if you will, they don't operate very different. You go against the powers that be, you become their enemy, and you're dead meat. So, and if you're a doctor and they count on that because they mean the establishment, and I know that through my research, and it's really not rocket science, anybody can investigate and see it, counted on doctors and counted on nurses. I've read countless papers in the academic literature in the course of my research where the establishment, representatives or stenographers, so to speak, right? If you want to be a little less polite, they rely on doctors and nurses to reproduce the dominant narrative. And when you don't, you become a pariah, you become a heretic. It's like a religious ideology, right? You're not forbidden, you're not forgiven, right? You can't be redeemed until you repent. It's sort of that kind of process, very, similar to sort of, the Spanish Inquisition or something like that.
Yeah. Claudia, thank you so much. I didn't ask you any of the questions I was supposed to, but here we are. Anyway, so we're just looking at the time, Phil. Claudia, I just wanted to get, I know that you could probably talk for forever about the outcome of the surveys that you did, but maybe we can just do a couple minutes of the outcome of the surveys and kind of the most, the things that you were most surprised of or the most important things that you got out of the survey. And then we can get into asking, our members can ask you and Dr. Hoffe some questions after.
Yes. Well, I'm going to be very brief. As you say, Terry, the surveys were similar across the board in that, of course, but there may be some inbuilt bias. The people who replied to me, the unvaccinated, of course, hated the mandates, and for very good reason. They were very good reasons. So one of the things that stands out, I knew it, but now it's documented that these people weren't crackpots. It had nothing to do with political ideology. It had to do with the fact that they had been able to assess scientific and clinical bedside experience, right? But they had been dismissed as crackpots or harmful and et cetera, et cetera. So I documented that. But what it was salient and very interesting is the amount of coercion I found among the vaccinated, partially, fully, boosted, whatever it was at any given moment. So those folks who were a minority of those who responded to my survey had also accepted. They hadn't accepted. They were coerced. You can't call that acceptance. It's like, accepting to be robbed in the middle of a street by someone who points a gun against your head and says, your wallet or your life, right? You're going to give them your wallet, right? That's not acceptance. That is threat, coercion. So that was a situation of the few vaccinated respondents that I got, although there was a striking small minority of respondents who were vaccinated in the province of Alberta, who were real true believers of the mandate message. And it was interesting to see, and I'm saying it with very great respect because they were healthcare workers and anyone else, they had been so persuaded of the dominant message that for them, non-compliance meant betrayal of your duties towards patients. So for them, not jabbing them, because I believe that, I take them at face value. I don't believe they're making any money out of doing what they're doing. These were, nurses, frontline nurses. There wasn't a single doctor. But that they really believed that they were harming patients if they weren't vaccinated, and that those of you who weren't were recklessly harming patients too. Now, my conclusion, of course, is I'm not a relativist. I think that there's a truth of the matter, and that these people, the propaganda apparatus was so overwhelming that they truly achieved that kind of, in a few voices, I can't say of more, and we are now in the process of actually having we're going to start in-depth interviews, and I'd like to talk to some of these people. They truly, they really incorporated these imperatives that in order to be a good practitioner, you have to jab people. And I understand that because in South America, where I'm from, there is a culture of vaccination where vaccination is almost like, like a virginal, religious thing that you just don't dispute. If you're a good parent, you vaccinate your child. And so you don't have to force people. For instance, I'm now expanding some part of the study to the policies in medical establishments, including a European country, Germany and Mexico. And people in Mexico willingly accepted the jab. Now, some people didn't, and they didn't do it, and nobody forced them. There were no mandates there. But many people willingly, because we have such a strong tradition where we just, I grew up thinking that it was the best thing you could do after drinkable water, social determinants of health, good nutrition, exercise, etc. You vaccinate, right? What little did I know that it was not correct, right? Because I've done nothing but study vaccination beyond COVID since 2021 now, but I wasn't intending it. I was never interested in the topic, so that's the thing. right? So those are the results again. Majority people opposed it. A lot of coercion among the vaccinated too. They had to feed their families. They felt terrible. The mental health consequences were atrocious and heartbreaking, like heartbreaking. Even thinking about them makes me very angry. But better to do something productive than being angry. So I do the research and write it. But then there's a few people, and I think that those few were instrumental in carrying the voice, right? So they took them and they kind of represented the voice of the establishment. And because they have medical credentials, they're respected by the public.
Thank you, Claudia. That's amazing. I think the one thing that I wanted to bring up was the one thing I noticed in all three of the survey results. And just for Philip, for the BCPSEF members that are here, I don't know if they've seen the surveys. And yes, it's regarding healthcare workers, but in my opinion, it's going to be very similar for your members. But one of the things that really hit me hard, and I didn't realize, Claudia, I think it was 1 in 4 people who were affected by mandates were considering suicide, right?
Yes,
And that
absolutely.
was,
Yes. Yeah.
so Claudia, just so you know, that was a really big reason why we started our groups at the very beginning, was because there were people who were suicidal, like people were, there were people getting divorced, people losing their homes, it was so originally when we formed our groups at the beginning, it was just to support everyone because we knew that there was that, and I did not know that it was like 1 in 4, right?
Well,
That's it.
let me just clarify, just for the record, right? This is among the survey
Yes.
that, of course, is a survey that, is responded or replied by people who responded to a survey of somebody who's asking questions that allow them to express dissent, right?
Right.
Of course, that's not well seen or well looked at. I had great difficulty publishing them. They would say, oh, this is biased because you get all these people. Well, how do you know? You get all the other people because you don't even bother ask these. So I had to argue very hard to get these things published. And now I'm still, some of the Alberta things are out, but I'm still fighting with a peer review system. So, but what we can say that it doesn't matter if it's 25% or not, because it shouldn't be like even 1%. Why would, I mean, ethical principles are not, a popular contest, right? So it's not about a popular contest, how many people are for or against, doing something which is wrong. It's just morally wrong, period. So, uh, and again, as Dr. Hoff was saying, where did the principle of informed consent go? And, Nuremberg, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that that should be, a real, alarm, right? If in fact the people at the top, cared. I'm not sure about that, and I don't read minds, but I think that the only alternative is just to fight back and defend yourselves and just refuse to comply. I mean, I said that I didn't have any clinical experience, but I have my own experience. I was very afraid when I started seeing what I was seeing, and I hadn't felt afraid in many decades, right? So it was a striking, right? And so I can imagine being in the shoes of somebody who, you know, whose life depends on it, and you're giving up on that, and you lose your marriage, you lose and family was supportive, but other people were not, or you lose your source of income and you can no longer feed your family, right? It must be horrible, and it shouldn't happen.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Phil, I think I'll pass it back over to you here.
Yeah, sure. So we can take questions for Dr. Hoff and Dr. Chaufan. If you want to put your questions in the chat, we'll read them out. If you want to ask a question, just put your hand up and we'll unmute you, and just know that you'll be recorded. But maybe just kick it off, I have a question for both Dr. Hoff and Dr. Chaufan. And we're about 2 days away from celebrating the national holiday, Canada Day here, and it's maybe a coincidence that you're both immigrants to Canada, but have lived here for many decades. So Dr. Hoffe coming from South Africa, Dr. Chaufan from Argentina. Just wondering if your opinion of Canada has changed since you first arrived in Canada, and if so, how? And maybe secondarily to that, many of us were dismayed by what happened through our governments in Canada, provincial and federal, with the mandates, and that resulted, of course, in a mass kind of popular uprising, which you mentioned, Dr. Chaufan, in Ottawa with the trucker convoy 3 years ago, and then the brutal suppression of that and the use of war powers through the Emergencies Act, and then subsequently that's been found to be unconstitutional. So do you feel that democracy and freedom in Canada is salvageable? Many people feel disenchanted and disillusioned, like, maybe it's a lost cause, but as people who came to this to this country intentionally to develop a life, and I take it you've become Canadian citizens now and have lived here for decades. How has your view of Canada changed, and do you feel optimistic about the future and our possibility of kind of reclaiming our rights and our democracy, or do you feel otherwise? So, whoever wants to take that first, kind of a long-winded question, but thought it'd be
I'll let
interesting.
Charles go first.
Okay, certainly. Yeah. So I came to Canada in 1990, and I really saw it as a land of freedom and opportunity. That's why I came here. And it has changed completely. But one of the things that troubled me right from the beginning, firstly, I was deeply troubled by the fact that Canada was, I think, the only Western nation that had a government monopoly on healthcare, where private hospitals were illegal. And I mean, it's usually only, in fact, it is only communist countries that have that model, where there is not a two-tier system of private and government. And that troubled me, that Canadians were so comfortable with that level of socialism. Because I remember here in BC, we had to pay premiums. I had to pay, I had a family with 4 kids, we had to pay $150 a month as a premium for healthcare. And I tried to opt out. I said to them, I don't want to pay, there's nothing wrong with my family or me or we don't need healthcare, and I'm quite capable of looking after myself and my family, and I don't want to pay you $150 a month. And I was told I was not allowed to opt out. You have to have the nanny state. You have to have the government looking after you, whether you want it or not. And so this troubled me, that this is communism, where the government is your parent and you are not allowed to look after yourself. So I was troubled by that, and I was also troubled by the fact that Canadians just seemed to be so laid back. They seemed to be morally spineless. They didn't seem to stand up. The Americans seemed to have so much more sort of moral fiber, where they really got worked up about things that were wrong, and Canadians just kind of went along with anything. And that troubled me, that they were so laid back. And I think we've seen that in this pandemic, that they were way too trusting. Yeah, I came from Africa, and in this pandemic, I think when you look at the whole of Africa as a continent, 6% of people got vaccinated. And the reason was twofold. Firstly, most of them don't have television, and they didn't see people dropping dead around them. And so they knew there was no emergency and this was all a fake. And so they certainly weren't about to have some shot that they didn't know anything about and they knew they didn't need. And so they didn't get vaccinated. But the other thing was, they have known for generations that their governments are not trustworthy. They don't believe anything the politicians say. So when the government told them they needed these shots, they said, forget it. And so The problem in Canada is that the people are way too compliant and way too trusting. And the biggest take-home message should be from because almost everything that the government, the media, and public health told us about COVID and COVID vaccines turned out to be false. Almost everything was the opposite of what they told us. And so if anybody still trusts them, they're a moron. I mean, really, and we need to remember this. We need to remember when somebody has deceived you and lied to you and abused you, you need to remember it, because the biggest predictor of future behavior is past behavior. If you want to know how somebody's likely to behave in the future, just look at how they behaved in the past. The people have revealed their character, how dishonest and manipulative and unjust they have been. So yes, I have hope for the future, because I think more people have woken up than ever before. I think the truckers' convoy woke up a lot of people. They are my heroes of this pandemic, were the truckers. I love them. I mean, what they did was so important. And it revealed the dishonesty and it revealed the tyranny of the government. It revealed that the government is not interested in democracy. It's not interested in debate. It's not interested in transparency. It is just a draconian, tyrannical regime. And their response to the truckers revealed that. It revealed how fragile our financial system is. That the government has control over all the banks, so that your money in the bank that you thought was your money, they can shut it down at any minute. So it shows we can't trust the banks, we can't trust the government, we can't trust the media, we can't trust the public health. We need to remember that. And we need to be wise in the future, because they're going to do this again in some other variant. But we need to learn from this so that next time around we can be more wise.
Thanks for that answer, Dr. Hoff. And I wanted to give Dr. Chaufan a chance to answer that question too.
Remind me the question.
So
I was kind of fascinated listening to Dr. Hoff, but I lost the question.
Sorry, it was about being someone who's an immigrant to Canada. How has your perspective of Canada maybe changed over time since you first came, and what do you think about the future and our prospects as a country?
Okay, so my story is somewhat different. It is similar in the shock that I experienced. I think that a paradigmatic moment was to see Trudeau, former Prime Minister, say to the Canadians in the political campaign, you won't be able to do this. You won't. I can't remember the quotation, but you won't be able to ride a train, to go to this, to go to that. I had experienced that already. To hang out with other people, etc., etc. And then the infamous line, "You're misogynist, racist," and so on. So I thought, authoritarianism doesn't have political orientation, because I experienced that on the right, coming from a right-wing military dictatorship. And at that time, when I was growing up, it was the left that was the boogeyman and the object of assault. So if you were identified with the left, you were, fodder, and we're a legitimate target, right? And the communist witch hunt, etc. So I grew up under that, and I thought, well, it's got to be that the left is the liberation and the right is right. And I thought I was wrong, right? I was absolutely just wrong. I mean, this is not a right-wing government. I mean, I don't think of it as a socialist or communist, etc. But it's called a democracy, whatever it is. It's certainly not democratic, because I'm not being asked in my opinion. And so many workers out there are not being asked their opinion. They're actually being forced to take an injection, which is a pretty powerful thing to say, right? That's, thing of, the Nazi regime, that kind of thing, right? Forced medical experimentation. So it was quite shocking. I did not come, I have not been here for that long. I came to Canada with a short contract in 2016, went back to the USA when where I was living. And as it turned out, my own background in California turned out worse. So thankfully I was in a slightly, California was tremendous with the mandates in academia and in healthcare. So if you were part of the healthcare system or the higher education system and you didn't agree with the jobs, you were dead meat. And in my own university. So thankfully I wasn't there, but it wasn't, it wasn't that much better. I was quite lucky here, and I'm not going to go into the details, but why I was left alone. But so it did change my notion of Canada. I came to Canada with a lot of great admiration. I had friends and people I knew that in 2015 were elated that Trudeau had been elected. And when I came and settled down, we settled down essentially in 2018 when I got a permanent position in academia. And then in 2021, I believe I became a citizen, Canadian citizen, or 2022 even. So I'm very new, but I was shocked. I did not expect, I just did not expect, and I think I probably was a bit naive that such level of tyranny was possible in a country like Canada. Medical tyranny, but also tyranny in other things, as Dr. Hoffe was mentioning, uh, blocking people from their own bank account. That happened in Argentina in the year 2001, and the people came out in the street and the government was overturned, right? The president had to leave in a helicopter, just pulled out of the country to a safe place across the River Plate. It just was, that's what, when people went to the bank, just to the banks, and the bank said, sorry, can't give you your money, right? Probably they hit more people than here. So I was shocked at that. I was very afraid. I think that the response of the Canadian public was tremendous, led by those truckers who inspired people throughout the world, including Latin America. And I have a lot of hope because across, over these past years, I've met a lot of people who resist at a cost of a lot of suffering. So, I mean, I, I think that, I mean, there's certainly what it takes, right, among Canadians. The question is that you have to be persuaded that you are in the right position to defend your right, medical autonomy and bodily autonomy, etc. Right? If they aren't, the propaganda campaign is very, very strong, and I can see how people can be persuaded. So I have some hope for the future, but I completely agree. I couldn't agree more with Dr. Hoff that people need to be prepared because this is not over. I don't think this is over. There's enough signs, and I mean, they've come back with new pandemic, the new virus, and new this and new that, and many people tune out, but not all of them. I think it's a matter of a critical mass. If enough people say, you know what, I'm not doing this. It just you can't have everyone on board, but there's got to be enough people. If there is enough people, then I have some hope, and people have to resist. They have the right to resist, and that's how history has always worked, right? You fight back oppression with resistance.
Well said. We could go on for hours, and I would love to. And we said we would take questions from our audience, but we've already reached the end of the time that we had scheduled for this. How are you for time? There's a couple of good questions in the chat, at least. Would you be able to go for another 5 or 10 minutes to respond to some more questions?
Yeah, I don't have any time limit, so whatever works for
Okay.
you. Yeah.
I'm totally fine.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, so again, getting back to, and sorry, Terry, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask one of those questions?
Yes, thank you, Phil. So I've been watching the chat, and I mean, you guys, everybody has great questions in here. I don't really know why people aren't putting their hands up. Maybe they're intimidated by you. Oh, I don't have my camera on. Sorry, you guys. So you guys, this one is, I'm going to put a little bit of my own spin on it. So I was a lab technologist. So I saw all the lab results. I had access to all the doctor's reports. I knew that it was kind of a sham from the beginning. However, my coworkers didn't. My coworkers were like, "Oh, just go and get vaccinated," right? So this is where this question comes in. Like, it's kind of near and dear to me, is why do you guys think, and I'm really interested to hear both Dr. Hoff's perspective as well as a sociologist's perspective on this, is why did so many healthcare workers just give in rather than looking at the data in front of them and making informed decisions? What from your perspective do you think was a reason for the decisions that healthcare workers made?
Can I chime in on that first?
Absolutely.
I think there were a couple of factors. I think the first was fear. And I think that healthcare workers were just as vulnerable to the propaganda as anyone else. If you were watching your television, you were going to get brainwashed. It was powerful. And when this pandemic broke, I happened to be in South Africa visiting my mother, and she watched Sky News all the time, this BBC. And I came back nervous because as an ER physician, I knew that we were told that there were these doctors and nurses in China that were dying, and we were seeing all these people in hazmat suits. And I knew that as an ER physician, I was going to have to be intubating these people and putting them on ventilators and right in the front line. And then there were a couple of inconsistencies that appeared. Do you remember early on there was that cruise ship called the Diamond Princess? And that was literally in January and February of 2020. This was before it was called COVID. It was before there was a pandemic. There was this Japanese cruise ship of 3,700 people where somebody got COVID. And they were taken off to a hospital, and it was identified as COVID. And then the whole ship was put into quarantine, where we then could see what was going to happen to those 3,700 people. And there were 1,000 crew members on that boat, and there were 2,700 passengers. And so most of the passengers on cruise ships are elderly. They're usually retired people, but most of the crew are all young people. And so in this floating, just like in my little community, I knew how many had been vaccinated, I knew how many injuries that had appeared, and I could give statistics. This was the same kind of thing. This was like a closed system where we could actually get an idea. So how dangerous is this actually? And we knew literally within, probably by March of 2020, that despite this ship being full of COVID, not one single one of those crew members died. Out of the 1,000 crew members, none died, and they had no PPE, and they carried on. Even though these passengers were told to isolate themselves in their cabins, they were taking 3 meals a day to these people in their cabins with no PPE. They were cleaning their cabins, making their beds, looking after them, and none of them died. So we knew early on that this was only a risk to elderly people. And of the passengers, there were actually 7 who died in the end in total, of which the median age was 82. So we knew very early on that this was only a risk to the frail elderly and was not a risk to young people. And so this revealed to me that there was a huge logical inconsistency between this panic by the media and this little floating laboratory that showed us that this was taken way out of proportion. So that, in terms of how we're going to know next time, look for the logical inconsistencies. When they start quarantining perfectly healthy people, anybody in healthcare knows that to quarantine perfectly healthy asymptomatic people is absolute stupidity. We never quarantine healthy people. It's completely illogical. And so, when they were forcing these truckers, unvaxxed truckers, to quarantine for 14 days every time they crossed the border, it was absurd to quarantine asymptomatic, healthy people to cross a border where the same virus is already on both sides of the border. I mean, anybody that couldn't see the logical stupidity of all of this, it has to be 3 days dead. So I think this is the first thing, is look for the logical inconsistencies. When when these vaccine mandates came, everybody, I think, knew that it didn't stop COVID. It didn't stop you getting COVID, and it didn't stop you spreading COVID, because very rapidly all the vaccinated people were all getting COVID. And yet they still believed that they were somehow keeping people safe by being vaccinated. And the corollary of that was that if you wouldn't get vaccinated, you were putting people at risk. But meanwhile, it wasn't even a vaccine, because it didn't make you immune to anything. So look for the
Charles,
yeah.
So I have to, just interrupt a bit. And this is how we all feel. And so we know this, and all of our healthcare workers who are in on this meeting saw it. So you think is fear kind of the number one reason why the others just kind of, decided to go the other way? So I'm interested to hear if Claudia has anything else to say other than the fear side of it, because I agree that I think that they were just scared at first and they weren't thinking scientifically. They weren't looking at what they were actually seeing. Claudia, is there any other aspect other than the fear aspect, do you think?
Well, I was listening to Dr. Hoffe, but it's interesting because I also overlooked that we think of us as, natural experiment of the Diamond Princess, right? That boat that I got to, of course, when I woke up to certain things, then you begin to connect the dots, and then everything makes sense. And you say, well, how could I have been so stupid and overlook this? Well, I was paying attention to other things. And of course, life is life, and you have, many other kinds of concerns, distraction. That was also a year when I actually was quite sick. It was independent from COVID, so I wasn't paying that much attention. But but there were tons of evidence out there already early on, including just, taking a look at the registration of the trial and seeing that the stopping transmission or infection wasn't even a clinical outcome of the trial, right? So anybody with access to the internet could read that. But the question is, why were some doctors and health professionals? Well, again, it has to do, in my opinion, it's not a very sophisticated answer I'm going to give you, but, with the hierarchy, the social hierarchy of doctors, there's kind of a joke in Argentina: if you put a stone at the door of the School of Medicine, you just dump it for 6 years, then come out a doctor, right? So, like, you don't have to be like that bright to actually get a medical degree. You have to have a good memory. You have to memorize a lot. That's true. And then it's a very hierarchical profession in all sorts of ways. And you are taught, you're taught a number of incompatible goals, right? You have to exercise, your clinical judgment and, patient care centered, blah, 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 but respect authority. You really can't have it both ways, because oftentimes authority doesn't know what it's doing, right? And they're speaking nonsense. But you have this sort of ingrained respect, at least in my experience, of authority. So I always respected my, bosses, right, at the hospital. And sometimes I thought that they weren't terribly smart, but, you respect them, right? So it's really authority. So doctors are taught to memorize and respect authority. And what are nurses taught? Well, it doesn't matter how stupid the doctor is, you obey the doctor, right? Because you can't defy them, otherwise, you'll be penalized, right? So I think that the medical establishment, the healthcare profession is very hierarchical, and that kind of goes against exercising independent judgment. But of course, the other question then would be, well, the counterexample, devil's advocate, well, in academia, you're supposed to be a free thinker. And I saw the same degree of compliance, if not worse, and people in academia, academics who should know better because they're supposed to be intellectuals, be extremely afraid, like freakingly afraid of the students who may not be jabbed. So we have to make sure that they come with their vaccine passport or whatever, etc. I also study the academic sector sort of independently, and of course that's the sector I have. So it is a mix of fear, hierarchical systems of thought that are presented with a facade of democracy, but in reality it's not quite like that. I mean, so long as you go along with us, we're democratic, but don't ruffle the feathers, too much. And when you study, as I have, the history of propaganda, you learn that doctors played a major role in different moments in history to carry out establishment policy. For instance, they sold the world cigarettes, right? They were instrumental in the Nazi regime system of experimentation with human beings, right? So doctors have played a disturbing role, and not just the Nazis, but also in North America. I mean, we have all kinds of medical experimentation of indigenous populations and people who are poor or people who are different, et cetera, et cetera. North America, including Canada, largely the US because they're bigger, there is a disturbing history of just the medical profession as a profession. So you have free thinkers kind of isolated, like Dr. Hoffe, but you usually end up like assaulted and if not, destroyed. I'm thankful to see so many colleagues of ours in Canada who have fought back. I know many of them, right? Not personally, but some of them I do. So it's a mix of like personal things, like I said, fear, stupidity, undue respect to authority, lack of independent critical thinking, not trusting your guts. And also because you are rewarded by obeying. You're not rewarded when you disagree. Dissenters are not rewarded, right? So you have to have a lot of courage to be a dissenter. So it's not like a solution, but it's just a loose set of observations.
Thank you so much, Claudia and Dr. Hoffe. I mean, it was just, you guys kind of hit the nail on the head, and it's what we all knew. I just thought there might be something different in there. I do also want to say, I think Dr. Hoffe brought it up, is the media played a really big role. So, I mean, I didn't watch mainstream media at that time. So if you weren't watching the media, you might have had a little bit of a different, a different headspace, right? Because you weren't being told what to do through the media, right? That sort of thing.
There's one other thing, Terry.
Go ahead.
No, but I just wanted to mention that I think, doctors are told to part of that hierarchical system that Claudia mentioned is that you follow public health. They are the authority. They tell you that they have these sort of what are called clinical practice guidelines, and there's a sort of a standard of care, and so we're taught that we must respect authority and obey it and trust it. So what we learned in this is that this authority that we thought was trustworthy has been captured and is no longer trustworthy. And Health Canada gets most of their funding from the pharmaceutical industry. That's who they serve. You're serving whoever pays you. So of course, the media will never tell people this, that Health Canada gets approximately 90% of its funding from the pharmaceutical industry. That's who they're looking after. They're not looking after the people of Canada. They shouldn't be called Health Canada. They should be called the Pharmaceutical Lobby Group, or so. I don't know. So I think it was laziness to a large degree that contributed to many doctors being captured. It was a combination of laziness to not look behind the curtain, to not question the narrative, And I questioned it because I saw the logical inconsistencies of what we were being told. It logically didn't fit. And so, but other people were just way too trusting and way too compliant and just following that hierarchical structure. And I think we have to become free thinkers. We have to question everything. And I think that's the way to the future.
Mm-hmm.
That's so true.
If I may add something, it's true that the reward comes with compliance, etc., social, right, compliance, but there's also a very, very threatening system of sticks, right? So it's the carrots and the sticks. So when I came across the documents that doctors were sent, what happens to them if they don't obey, right? So they don't put the gun against your head, but the gun is against your head, frankly, right? You're going to this, that, and the other thing, and ultimately lose your license. So it's kind of, it's subtle, but it's not so subtle. But again, it's more subtle than an actual gun pointed against your head. So there are guns pointed against dissenters, metaphorical and actual, because if they take away your ability to work, then that's it. There goes your livelihood. So it's kind of a subtle combination. Now, just to be a little bit of a devil's advocate, so when you watch the media, which I do all the time, but I watch it to understand systems of persuasion and propaganda. I watch it because I study the mechanisms of persuasion. So, but when you believe, as I did at the very beginning, and I didn't see the propaganda in the public health messaging at the very, very beginning, I believed it. But when I began to understand what was actually going on, I began to see it as I know what it is because I've known, I know that the media lies. I don't have to be taught that. And I know when I know a topic very well, I can actually watch the media, but it's instructive because I understand how they're propagandizing people. I find that very revealing and useful for me, for my own understanding. So, in my opinion, more than watching or not watching or what you watch is being able to be exposed to a range of views and also to be trained in sort of critical thinking and critical judgment, right? I mean, this is just for people out there, right? To take everything with a grain of salt, particularly when you're inclined to believe something. So then you'll be more skeptical, right? Because I was trained as I said, in a medical culture where vaccines are, essentially like God, right? So you don't dispute them. And I think that the fact that they went so far with COVID is shooting themselves in the foot because now way more people are alert. So that's the silver lining of all this. So many more people like myself. I would have never, I was, it was everything vaccines. Why would I be interested in vaccines? I'm not at all. But now that's all I do. I just recently finished a study on vaccines and autoimmunity. If you had told me that 5 years ago, I thought, why would I care about that? Right? So I think that they've alerted too many ordinary people because when you alert somebody, like an academic, who cares, right? But if you alert a lot of ordinary people, that's where the real strength is the power of the people. So I think we've got a chance.
I love that addition there, Claudia. That's amazing. I see, Phil, you just came back on. I was just going to go to Benita, who was our first question. Are we okay to keep going here?
Yeah, as long as our guests are, I think maybe there's 3 hands up, and there's one really relevant question, I think, in the chat. So if we're able to cover those, and then maybe we should let people call it a night. I know it's getting late in Ontario, but back to you.
Hey, Claudia is still on, so we'll keep her on. I think I just saw Scarlett there. She might have had to go to a call or something. She's actually working. So Benita, I think you're first up there.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you both for taking the time to meet with us tonight. I guess I remember hearing reports from the United States stating that doctors and hospitals were getting extra money for dealing with COVID patients. Do either of you know if that's the case in Canada?
In BC, I do not think it was the case. I think the people who were high up, who were most likely given huge amounts of money to combat vaccine hesitancy. That is my suspicion, but I don't have any proof of that. But I did hear that in Manitoba, that doctors, there was a new billing schedule on the billing for patient appointments that a doctor could effectively double his billing per patient by talking to the patient about the COVID vaccine. And it didn't, there was no, somebody sent this to me, but it was only Manitoba that I knew about. And it was all about combating vaccine hesitancy. Obviously, this was seen as a huge issue. So that's the only thing that I'm aware of.
So in Ontario, my experience, well, in academia, we were showered with millions of dollars in grants to study vaccine hesitancy, which of course frames the problem already as one of people who, for whatever reason, are, recalcitrant, pathological, doubters that the vaccine is a good thing. How would you doubt that, right? I mean, anybody in their own sane mind should not. So they give you money to study that. That's one thing. On the medical front, I was able to, I didn't know, but I've seen that now documentation where doctors are paid for meeting certain best practices, clinical standards, percentage of vaccination, for instance, in their patient population, not in relation with COVID specifically, but sort of generally. Recommending statins, for instance, is one of the things that gets paid. So they're kind of benign, right? So, if you, check your patient's, blood pressure, who would have a problem with that, right? Or et cetera. How many people have you counseled about exercise? How many people have you counseled about X and Y and Z? So very generic and prior to COVID-19, as a matter of fact. With respect to COVID, people getting specifically paid for, vaccinating, et cetera. So there was I learned this through a kind of a media scandal, because there was a doctor who was hiring her own students, like medical practitioners and, residents in hospital, and she was cashing a lot of money, and the residents were doing the dirty work, and then she was kind of dividing up in collecting. So she was filing, but she wasn't saying that she was actually hiring underlings, right? So that kind of thing, not as direct as in the U.S. Probably whoever asked the question, you see you have the documents from the insurance companies rewarding patients for the number of COVID vaccines, percentage of COVID vaccines in their patient population. Or actually individually too. So I think that Canada, just to like a high level summary, there are indirect. So I thought, well, it's not a for-profit system where, people make profit, etc. Well, they do, because there's a lot of reward mechanisms if you do certain things, and there's penalties when you don't do those things. So that works equally efficiently, in my opinion.
Very interesting. We have a couple of questions left with hands up. Zoom user. Please go ahead if you're able to unmute.
Philip, it's Zoran. I don't know whether my name is as a Zoom user.
Yes, Zoran, you're coming through loud and clear.
Good. Thank you. I want to thank guests for their courage and for being willing to address to our group. From Dr. Hoffe, whether at any point of time during his process, the medical exemption from the vaccination form was brought up, and what does he think about that form?
I was asked by many people for vaccine exemptions. So a lot, as you know, everyone that worked for the government was mandated to have it. I got a lot of RCMP asking me to do vaccine exemptions. Apparently, there are 30,000 RCMP in Canada, and one vaccine exemption was granted. One out of the entire country. And they had ridiculous criteria. In order to meet the government criteria for a vaccine exemption, you had to have either had proven anaphylaxis or myocarditis from your first shot. In other words, if your first shot almost killed you, then you might qualify to not have the second. But if you hadn't had any, there was nobody would get it. I mean, it was absurd. It was completely absurd. And so but I did vaccine exemptions for teachers and for all sorts of people. Some were approved and some were not. I had to be very careful about how I did it, because I knew that other doctors had their licenses suspended. If they decided that there was something that you put in your vaccine exemption letter that was not correct, it was considered to be fraud and you could lose your license. And so, Stephen Malthouse, who's a family doctor on Denman Island, he had his license suspended over a mask mandate, a mask exemption letter, where the college was literally a setup, where the college sent a fake patient who he spoke to on the phone, and this patient was asking for a mask exemption. And the patient, and so of course this was a fake patient who was recording everything, and it was a trap. And he said, well, so why do you want the mask exemption? What's the issue with the mask? And the patient said, well, I don't want to wear one. They don't work, and they're dehumanizing, and they're unhealthy, and I don't want to wear a mask. And so he said, well, I quite agree, and he gave him the letter, and he literally had his license suspended. And so I realized, and I knew that they were trying to find things to trap me off. I mean, there were some things that I didn't mention in my opening thing, where they tried to accuse me of being unfit to practice medicine and told me I needed to go for counseling. And I refused to cooperate. I said, I do not need your counseling. I'm not anxious. I'm not afraid. I sleep well at night, and I have a clear conscience. And I do not want or need your counseling, and I just refuse to comply. But they clearly were trying to, and then when I did the D-dimer research to show the microclotting, they told me I wasn't allowed to have done that. I had to have applied to an ethics committee. If I wanted to do research, I have to apply to an ethics committee. So I knew, and I said to them that this is absurd, because it is routine in medical care to monitor treatments with blood tests. If you're on chemo, you have blood tests every time before you have the chemo to see if, and afterwards to see if it's safe to keep on. If you're on biological therapies for autoimmune arthritis, you have blood tests often every month, so maybe at the most every 2 months, to see if the treatment's causing harm. And I said to them, that's all I was doing. I was monitoring patients. So I knew that they were looking for things to trap me on, and I was very careful. And so I had many requests for vaccine exemptions. And there were some people that I said, no, there actually isn't any scientifically defensible reason why you can't have this. That is particular to you. You couldn't just give statistics. I realized that you can't just say this has got the worst safety record of any medical treatment in history. And you don't want it. I mean, either of those should be a valid reason for not having it. But I knew they weren't accepting those reasons. And so I was just very careful, because I knew they were trying to take me down.
Yeah, thank you for it.
Yeah.
I was going to say thank you for your response. I just wanted to follow up. I did ask for the exemption based on the post-COVID natural immunity, and worked with my doctor, provided tons of the information and everything else. But the response was, sorry, Zoran, I may lose my license and the livelihood. I cannot give you. That was the phone conversation. He was afraid to put that in an email, although I tried a couple of times. So thank you for your response. Yeah.
If I may add, I had the same experience with one doctor, like you. I forget your name, I'm sorry. But I had the same experience. The person was at least honest enough to say, I'm afraid to lose, no, I need my job, I can't lose my license. But my own career, in fact, my own job was saved by a compassionate soul like Dr. Hoffe, who was also very assaulted, later a physician here in Ontario, who I asked and I provided some reasons, not that he needed any, and he gave me the exemption that saved my job. They accepted it, but it was a very tyrannical and very threatening and extremely, just frightening way of coercing people into not doctors into not doing what any well-trained doctor should do, namely respect the wishes of a patient, and also coercing patients to take it.
Great question, Zoran. We've got one last question of a hand raised. So we'll go to that question, and we've gotten a bunch more questions in the chat, but I'm afraid we'll just have to end it. I maybe reserve the right to ask one last question at the end, and then we'll call it an evening. So Brett, if you're able to unmute, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, Dr. Hoffe. There were other doctors who contradicted the official narratives about vaccines, such as the Vice President and Chief Medical Health Officer of Vancouver Coastal Health, Dr. Patricia Daly. Are you familiar with the letter that she wrote to the President of UBC, Dr. Santaono, dated February 16, 2022?
I remember it very vaguely, but I can't remember the details.
Okay. Yeah, well, she basically contradicted Dr. Bonnie Henry's opinions on the effectiveness of the vaccine. She said in the letter that essentially the vaccines were having no effect on infection and transmission of Omicron. And as far as I know, she wasn't disciplined or nothing happened to her. So yeah, I was just wondering if you knew about that letter, if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I do. I mean, that name is certainly very familiar to me, and I do now, thinking about it, remember that letter. I think for some reason I captured a lot of people. I captured a lot of attention. And so they realized that I was a problem. I mean, even to this day, wherever I go, I meet people who tell me I was the reason why they didn't get the shots, because they knew something wasn't right. But the fact that I was a family doctor who was willing to say, this is what I am seeing in my own patients. That firsthand evidence is very powerful. It's hard to refute when somebody is an eyewitness. I wasn't quoting statistics. I was quoting what I was seeing in my own patients. And so it put me in a unique situation where, why would I want to lie about that? I mean, why on earth would I want to stick my neck out and defy my gag order and say, this is really bad. I mean, this is not safe. This is causing serious harm. And so they really came after me, I think, because I became well known quite quickly. And from that D-dimer work that I did, that also went around the world. And I got letters from almost every country you can think of people asking about that, because it was sort of a fairly groundbreaking research showing that the majority of people were getting this hidden damage. Literally, it was microclotting in every part of their body, and their brain, and their lungs, in their heart, and reproductive organs, and wherever. And so I think just because of the fact that I spoke about firsthand evidence, and the fact that and the other, was the evidence, not just of what I was seeing in my patients, but by my D-dimer evidence. They really hated me. They hated me with a vengeance. And so I'm glad that Dr. Daly didn't get punished, but I was their chosen sacrifice, I think, to strike fear into the hearts of the rest of the medical profession.
If I may say, because I have used Dr. Hoff, interviews that you've given, just to show to my students, they have been quite impressed. I mean, like consistently impressed by how articulate you are. I mean, you describe your own experience with your patients in a very, very sort of systematic way. And these are people sometimes with medical backgrounds, sometimes without. They're, undergraduates, sometimes graduate students, but largely undergraduates. And it's been consistently very powerful to hear from a practicing physician, which I think is also an advantage, that if you think, given the respect that generally speaking, people have of the medical profession, but also the healthcare profession, right? Nurses, that's the power that you can use if you actually cogently present, your experience. You have the truth on your side, right? So that's very powerful too.
And I think one of the things I tried to do was to try and keep things as simple as you can. There were lots of other brilliant doctors, but they would often go into complicated science. And I think there's a great power in simplicity. And so I tried to, I really tried to focus on that and focus on just reason, just simple, logical reason to reach people. To show them those logical inconsistencies and to show them simple evidence that is irrefutable.
Beautifully said. You've both been very generous with your time, but we do have one last question that I really want to ask, because it is very timely. I think very important to particularly healthcare professionals in BC. And Dr. Hoff, you know all about this, but this is coming out of the new Health Professions and Occupations Act that was passed last year. And new college and regulatory bodies are being set up. And there's now a new one, the College of Health Care Professionals at BC, which will comprise audiologists, allied healthcare professionals, dietitians, occupational therapists, opticians, optometrists, physical therapists, psychologists, and speech pathologists. And they are circulating proposed draft bylaws for the college, which will make mandatory vaccination a condition of licensing. So I think we all expected this to come. It's sort of in their consultation phase, and now the government will be enforcing these mandates in the rules that people must comply with in order to work in the province. So do you have any comment on that? And for those who might not agree with that, what would be your message to them?
So my comment on that is so the BC College of Physicians and Surgeons is presently redoing their bylaws to conform to this new Health Professions Act. And so I wrote to them to show them all of the ethical inconsistencies, to draw their attention. So healthcare, well, the doctors are, I don't know about the nurses and the other groups. There is a code of ethics and professionalism of the Canadian Medical Association. And so one of their ethics is about informed consent, is that how you should never be able to force or coerce anyone to have a medical treatment that they don't want. So any vaccine mandate is a violation of the code of ethics of the Canadian Medical Association. So I wrote them a letter showing them, literally setting out all of the ethical violations of this act. The other one was, patient confidentiality. They've got this clause where they can raid your office and seize all your patient files, which completely violates the ethical code of patient-physician confidentiality, that the government can just take their medical records at any time for any reason, just take them. And so I don't know what else we do other than just appeal to if they're holding us to these ethics, then they must conform to them too. So I don't know how else other than people just leaving the province, just going to another province, I don't know what else we do. When during the COVID pandemic, towards the end of 2021, Dr. Bonnie Henry in BC announced that it was going to be a licensing requirement for everyone in healthcare, including doctors, even if you were working outside of hospitals, for everyone to have this COVID vaccine. And she stated on CBC News that if you do not want this vaccine, you're in the wrong profession. Those were her words. In other words, if you believe in the foundational ethic of patient bodily autonomy, if you believe in that, if you believe in informed consent, you're in the wrong profession, is effectively what she was saying. I mean, it was absurd. And so she set a date that by this date, every doctor has to be vaccinated. And the college then sent everyone emails to say, please, will you reveal your vaccine status? And then they did a survey in BC to see what percentage of people had no family doctor. And they found that there were 1 million people in BC with no family doctor. And so I think the politicians then suddenly realized that there were certain doctors that were not going to back down and would literally just leave the province. And they realized that they were about to become quite unpopular, as there were going to be even more people without family doctors. And so she canceled her mandate. She completely changed her mind and she backed off. But so the take-home message in this is we have to not back down. If enough people won't comply, we have power. If everyone just goes along out of fear, then we've lost.
So, Charles, do you think that they're going to stand up? So they did. So right after we got mandated, the healthcare workers in BC, they tried to apply it to all of the applied health, the chiropractors, the optometrists, the massage therapists, all of those people, and they backed down because I'm pretty sure it was because the chiropractors, ophthalmologists, all the big kind of doctors in those groups stood up and said, we're not okay with this. So is it going to go through with the HPOA?
I don't know. The HPOA is now law in British Columbia. So I don't know if it'll go through.
It will be awful. Like it will send, like I was talking with my naturopath and he's like, I'll just leave. Like,
Yeah,
what, I'm not.
I think that's what we're seeing right now. I mean, BC is in a crisis, and Dr. Hoffe, you can attest to this, I'm sure, but with emergency rooms closing all over the province, particularly in rural regions, and just a massive shortage of doctors and healthcare professionals across the board, so much so that we are sending patients to the Washington state for cancer treatment. The BC government is trying to recruit doctors and nurses from Seattle with free coffee trucks that they're paying for. It's really gotten to a level of just absurdity. So it does seem to be that kind of political calculation that they make. How far can they push and require? If enough people don't stand up and just simply comply, then they can go further. But if people do, and they say, look, you're gonna be shutting off the lights overnight, and no one's gonna be able to get care, worse than it already is now, then they will back off. So it is really up to individuals to make that stand, as far as I can see.
But then I have a question for you. Bill, right? I'm sorry. Phil. I have a question for you and for Terry, and perhaps for Charles too. I mean, but what kind of political power do you guys have in a group like? I mean, this group is a big group, right? What kind of political power, and why not, like, just hit the streets and really, I mean, you have to make them afraid that they will have really bad press, and you need support from other groups throughout the country and in the province as well, right? I mean, as I said, when they closed the banks in Buenos Aires, and all of a sudden, the president just had to flee. That was the end. That was it. for that presidency. That was 2001. And it happens throughout Latin America. We have revolutions. I mean, but people hit the streets, right? What happened with the truckers?
Mass
I'm not a
mobilization.
political organizer, but I know
No.
that it can be done. And the power is in the hands of people to hit the streets. And you say no, right? I mean, I'm not saying that it's easy, but that's the only way that you can stop, thugs from attacking you, right?
It is, yeah. And, and having worked in government, and I worked in the executive branch, and I worked closely with politicians, advising politicians. So I've seen it up close, the process, and I understand how they make political calculations and so forth. The fact is, just in BC over the pandemic, we were very divided. So there was a large number of people who believed very strongly in the stories they were being told by their politicians and public health officials and through the media and so forth. And then there was another group of people in a minority who did not believe that, but were very vocal. And certainly Dr. Hoffe is a leading light of that movement. But I think that strong belief on the other side has waned a bit now, 4 years later. And we're beginning to see the seeds of change. And the government is very tenuously holding on to power in British Columbia by a one-seat majority, and is doing other things that are causing a lot of people to question the mandate that they have. And so, these things do take time to disabuse people of misguided beliefs. But it does come down, I think, to that sort of population level public opinion, and it takes time to turn that, but we're making ground, and we've been very active in our advocacy and reaching out to all political actors. We invited all leaders of the major parties in the election year last year to speak to us. Only one took up our invitation, but we did interview him, and it was quite a thing, and it became a bit of a theme in the campaign. They used that interview as material to attack him, the leader of the opposition.
What about talking to people, like not just to politicians, but to other people, healthcare workers?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'll add that anyone can become a member, anyone who's a BC resident can become a member of our society. So we stand for two, basic values: medical privacy and bodily autonomy. We think those are pretty universal values that most people can get behind.
Right, because in my research, what I found that the few people, of course, that were vaccinated, right? Many people thought that it was a good thing to vaccinate, but they would still oppose the mandates on the basis of defending the medical freedom of others.
So, and that's where we stand, because we have many members who,
right? So you don't have to, you don't have to agree on the facts, but what you have to agree is on the ethical principles and just leave other people alone, right? So you can have those on your side too, on our side.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're a welcoming bunch, and we're going to continue on the fight, both in the public advocacy, in the political realm, and in the courts. So it's it's a broad-based effort, but it's really been a pleasure to speak to you and to speak to Dr. Hoffe, and to have you take questions from our members and our audience. And we will post this video in the coming days, and we hope to share it far and wide, and hope more people see it. So thank you for joining us. And
thank you so much for all the work you're doing.
Thank you so much for coming, you guys. We'll definitely get you on again. I know our members have many more questions for you. So thank you.
Well, thank you for organizing this. I mean, things like this are critically important. We've got to connect. We've got to network. We've got to support one another. We've got to brainstorm. We've got, unity is strength. And that was what they did in COVID, is they divided everybody up with fear and misinformation, and we need to guard against all those divisions. Unity is strength. That is what we have to do.
Well said.
Absolutely.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. It's been great to talk to you.
Great. Take care.
Thank you, everyone, for hanging in so late.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thanks. Have a great night.
You too.
For anyone still listening, we'll have more updates on the legal action coming later this year. So we're anticipating 10 more days of hearings on the class action certification for both the healthcare workers class action and the public servants class action, which are being heard simultaneously. So stay tuned for more updates, and we'll take a break now over the summer and reconvene again in September. So have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.